Ahoy! This is a Multiversus beginner tier list. Beginner is a very important focus point here because in advanced levels, Multiversus meta shifts very, very heavily. But I figured with the game coming out today, there's going to be a ton of new players that are just trying out the game for the first time that maybe want to figure out who their first character is and so on. And this is who this is for. So we're talking about how these characters perform on a beginner level of play, how easy they are to play, easy they are to pick up, and everything surrounding that. This is primarily focused on 2v2 as that's the main mode in itself, but a lot of it transfers over very well to 1v1 on lower levels of play. The differences in that regard show much more on higher levels of play. Like on higher levels of play, you'll see supports having much more value and so on. But on low levels of play, basically anyone who can win a 1v1 trade is generally going to do relatively well in 2v2s as well, because you're not playing as much with your teammates. You're not on that level where you're really playing based on synergy. Before we get into the tier list, I want to quickly point out my biases as well. Obviously, every tier list is personal opinion, but what I can say about myself specifically is that I generally prefer playing melee characters, and I find melee characters much easier to pick up. So as such, I am likely to rate melee characters relatively higher compared to ranged characters, just because the ranged characters, the mage characters in this game, in my opinion, are just harder to play, and I enjoy playing them less. This may be different for you if you just generally enjoy ranged characters, and then maybe your tier list would also look a fair bit differently. Now, let's get into the characters. The first one is Taz. Now, Taz got a massive nerf. Previously, he would have probably been around S tier, to be honest, because for beginners, there was just no way around the tornado spam, the Taz-nado spam, rather. Whereas now, I don't think that's any longer the case. On a higher level of play, I would probably put him down here somewhere. On a beginner level, I would say he's still around A tier. The Taz-nado spam is still something you can do, even though it is massively nerfed. It's way shorter now, but it's still something that is decently effective against other new players that don't know how to deal with it. So I think it's still okay, it's still good, and even though the rest of his kit is not that great for a beginner, I would say it's enough to justify A tier, just above average, whereas B tier would be average, but not way above average or anything. There are other characters that can compete with him much better now. The next character that, in my opinion, is well at the top right now is Finn. Now, Finn is generally considered strong on higher levels of play as well. It's pretty interesting that he kind of translates over across all levels pretty decently. And part of that is because of his very safe hurt boxes from his sword and his hit boxes, and his very easy combos and safe abilities. He has, in a way, a tornado similar to what Taz has with his backpack spin. It's not quite as oppressive, there are more angles to attack it, and it's not as long-lasting and fast and everything, but it's still very good. And outside of that, he just combos very, very nicely into himself. He can just use pretty much any of his side down up attacks and just use another follow-up attack after that without thinking too much about it, whereas other characters have to be much more considerate as to how they want to combo their abilities. His side special overrides a lot of other abilities as well, so you can counter very, very easily too. And altogether, that's very, very strong. And then he also has more advanced techniques on higher levels that can carry him a little bit further than that. Another character that I would put up in S tier is Shaggy. Shaggy is a character that would not perform as well on higher levels of play, but as a beginner character, he's great. His spammable ability is his side special, his kick. And he has a ranged ability as well, which you will not get punished for as often with the picking up the sandwich on lower levels of play. On higher levels of play, that might be something that eventually gets you in trouble. And as such, I think he's just overall a great character for most players to pick up and learn the game with as well. Just a nice introduction character, essentially. And that brings us to some more characters that I would put around A tier. Now, one that I would definitely put there is Batman. And as you can see, like I said, a lot of these are also very suitable for 1v1. These are all characters that would work pretty well in 1v1s as well. Taz maybe a little less so than the others, but the other three are very much known as beginner 1v1 characters at least. Batman has a bit more of an intricate kit, but he has a very safe ability with his Batarang. He also has a lot of easy mobility, can kind of grapple across the map, and he has decent means of defending himself. So I think he's just a nice all-rounder character to pick up for beginners, and he's a very popular character for a reason, I would say. In the same area, I would say we also have Superman. Now, Superman is a character that also probably falls off a little bit towards high levels of play. That's more down to attack priority, because he often gets beaten in that regard, but that's not really a problem as a beginner. There are a lot of abilities in his kit that can be used very easily to punish enemies because you get armor, and often new players will not quite play well against armor yet. You have a very nice grab, which can punish enemies that use their dashes, their dodges. And you also have the laser that hits the entire ground, so you don't have to worry much about aiming. So all in all, a nice combination of abilities that I think make this character very suitable for beginners just to learn the game with. And then eventually maybe hit a brick wall when you get to the very high level. But again, not a main concern at the start. Another character that I would probably put around this level, where I'm a bit more torn, she could maybe also be in B tier, is Harley Quinn. But I will say that I think her mix of melee and ranged, making her a pretty decent all-rounder, is something that works decently well for beginners too. She has nice safety abilities. She has a side special, for example, that can knock enemies away, just a little glove that you can shoot. And she can also get away with relatively safe hammer spam. She has that hammer neutral attack, which is just very, very strong and blocks off a lot of area around her. So we see a lot of that on the lower levels of play. She's not on the free rotation anymore. She was in the previous play test, alpha, whatever. But we will probably still see quite a few people picking her up. And it's one of those characters where you will definitely notice as well how experienced the player is, because the playstyle will vastly differ depending on how well they used her jack-in-a-box, her bomb, and all that stuff. But you can't go too wrong with her either. Like, most of the time there's something that you can use, and she also has that very nice side attack combo, which is very, very quick, which counters out a lot of other attack animations, meaning a lot of traits where you're simply running into each other just go in your favor, and that's something that really helps when you're new to the game. Also in this tier is, in my opinion, Wonder Woman. I think Wonder Woman is probably the easiest, more supportive character in the game, even though she has a lot of potential for higher levels of play as well. But I think she just has these general means of simple blocks around her, like blocking projectiles, having this area around her in a down attack that basically holds enemies in place, blocks them off. That type of stuff that just makes her generally very easy to pick up. She has a good neutral attack, even though I think her forward side attack is not the greatest because it's a bit short in range. She has a whip to pull enemies in. So yeah, good base utility, and of course for duo specifically it's important that she can also shield her allies and go to them. So I think that's one of the characters that's free or the character that is free after the tutorial for a reason, that just teaches you a little bit about everything in the game, but is also not too hard to learn at the same time, at least on a base level. So definitely a recommendation from me here, like in terms of tanks, that's the one that I started enjoying the most in the beginning. In this tier, I will also put Iron Giant, because I think on early levels of play, when people don't know how to counterplay him, he is very strong. I will actually put him more towards the start here, I think. Especially his down special, even after it's now fixed, is a very, very strong ability when the enemies don't know how to avoid it yet, and you can basically get away with spamming it most of the time. And many of his attacks are very telegraphed, but that doesn't really matter when the enemy doesn't know what to do with that yet. There is definitely potential to perform on higher levels with him as well. What I recommend if you're playing him is practicing dodging early. If you figure out how to dodge in place with him well so that you can punish enemies for basically jumping into you and trying to abuse your large hitbox, then you will have a much better time in later matches as well. So I think that's a very good way to start out with him, but in the beginning you're not going to get punished all that much. And he has a lot of nice utility. You also have that rage mode on top of that, which is extremely strong, and which enemies will also not quite know how to react against yet. The last character that I would put in this tier is Jake. Now with Jake, I'm somewhat more on the fence, because I think he could also be B tier really. It's somewhere in between. But I will put him here, because I think his side special especially is a relatively easy ability to use against beginners. If they don't quickly react, then you can basically spam that and knock them up over and over while riding around. You have your down special, which is pretty nice, and you especially have your down attack, your skateboard, which is an extremely potent ability, which I think just helps him a lot in picking up the game quite quickly. You also have a very strong side attack. The jumping side attack covers a lot of ground there, and you have a very strong up attack. So really a lot of good ways of zoning off enemies in different ways, of keeping yourself safe, that you just need to know about. Like with Jake, I would say he's a good character for beginners, but just hop into the lab once first, figure out what his abilities do, and then play him. That's the level of difficulty you have with him, because then you will understand how exactly you can use his different abilities to your advantage, and then you can go into the deeper tech for him later. But he definitely counters a lot of the other higher level characters as well very decently, because he has that very long range on his side attack, on his aerial side attack. And that's something that a lot of players early on will not know how to deal with. And it's also something that's worth learning very early on, because if you learn how to aim that early in the game, it'll carry you quite far. And that brings us to the B tier characters, which is basically the average performers that are usually a little bit harder to learn. The first one that I will put here is Bugs Bunny. I think Bugs Bunny is a mage and comparatively difficult, but compared to the other mage that we'll talk about later, he's not as difficult. And I think a lot of his base kit, a lot of his melee kit especially, works surprisingly well. Like, yes, he technically has quite a few abilities that require you to predict the enemy or be at range, but his one of his side attacks is very strong. I think it's this... I'm not even sure which one of his side attacks it was, but the jumping aerial side attack, where he basically kicks forward. And he generally, can really trade blows with a lot of melee characters, which would not be expected from a mage. And that makes him a lot easier to pick up than just relying on your ranged abilities on precise aim. Also in this tier, I will put Garnet. Maybe actually I will put her into A tier. I think Garnet is actually not B tier. She is relatively easy to pick up, I think. Relatively easy to play. The problem is that people just don't seem to like her, and not a lot of people are playing her. But yeah, she has that nice projectile block, and she also has a ranged attack, the rocket gloves. But she also punishes enemies strongly for getting close to her. So overall, I think she's an A tier worthy character. I think she's a bit easier to pick up than the rest of what we'll see in B tier. So we're putting her here. We're putting in B tier as well is LeBron. I think LeBron is hard to place at this point because he just came out, so I don't know for sure where we will be seeing him in the long run. But I think for a beginner, he has a fair bit of depth, he has a fair bit of complexity, but he can also get away very easily with spamming basketballs at the enemy over and over and over, and a lot of the time they probably not know what to do with it. And he also has these great punishes at ledges and relatively good spikes in general to knock out enemies on relatively low health. So that all in all makes me think that he is a little bit harder to learn because he has that secondary moveset, but you don't really need to do all that effectively in order to have an impact with him. He is significantly worse in 1v1 if you don't fully learn him though. So this is specifically in 2v2s where things are given to him a little bit more. Then in B tier, I would say next we probably have Arya. Arya, I think, is definitely one of the characters with a high skill ceiling, but I don't think her skill floor is actually as high as it may seem. Because after all, she still has relatively good melee swings. She especially has that down attack where she dodges under enemies, which makes it very, very easy for her to avoid a lot of the damage, and enemies really need to learn to play against that first. So yeah, as long as the enemy doesn't position that well and doesn't get their feet in the air, especially where she, in my opinion, performs worse, you will be pretty okay. You will not necessarily do all the highest level of play things that can be done with her, like face stealing into various combos and all that, but it's not that important at the start, as long as you can just decently keep yourself alive, keep enemies away from you, and combo them. She doesn't do this as well as Finn, so she's not going to be S tier, but she does it well enough still. It just feels like the risk-reward level is different from someone like Finn or like Shaggy, or even most of the A tier characters here. And she doesn't really have safe ranged abilities except her special, which has a relatively long cooldown. Then next in B tier, I would probably put around this range Reindog. Reindog technically has some very simple, straightforward abilities. You can also get away with a lot of ranged ability spam. You're not really getting punished for that all too much. You just need to learn his kit. Once you do that, he has great zoning potential, and I would say on higher levels of play, he's way above B tier, because I think he's actually insane in the right hands because of the ridiculous amount of damage that he can constantly do to pretty much anyone. But that's something you won't necessarily see that much when people are just starting out. But he's also not nearly as difficult as it may seem. He is free this week, you can just try him out, and I'm fairly certain as long as you go into the lab once and you learn his special abilities especially, you should be fine. Then we have Velma. I think Velma also takes B tier towards the end. Again, this is specifically in duos, and 1v1 this would be a bit of a different story, I think. But she has very good ranged harass potential, especially with her neutral attack. Just throwing speech bubbles at enemies and then using her other ranged attacks, and basically most of the time it's enough to zone enemies off. Now, if you run into enemies that are very smart about dealing with Velma, that just dive you with both players, that's a bit of a different situation. Then you will struggle. But that's not something you will see that much when playing against beginners. So I believe that on that level of play, she is a solid B tier character. And the last character that I will just barely put into B tier is Tom and Jerry. And I'm not even sure. I could maybe put him into C tier as well. It's just, I'm gonna put him into C tier actually, but with a disclaimer. So Tom and Jerry is technically one of the most complex characters in the game, and there are tons of things that can be done with him that, well, require a lot of practice to get the full combo and everything going. But at the same time, if you don't do all that, you're still probably gonna do okay. Like, he has decent enough ranged attacks, and well, just spamming some of those is not necessarily something that will be punished heavily, like just spamming your neutral special into the tennis balls and just throwing them back. Well, if you don't know how that works yet, then I guess it's a bit more difficult, but he's not actually as hard as you would initially think on a base level. On a high level of play, like maximum out, that's a completely different story. Maybe I will actually put him towards the end of B tier, but with a big asterisk. Like, he's really, you know, wherever you want him to be between those two. But it really depends on the matchup, on who you're running into as well, like how difficult that is for him and how aggressive they're playing on him. I've actually seen him being played a fair bit. I think people really like him, at least. And then last but not least, we have Steven Universe, who I will definitely put into C. I think Steven Universe is just a very strange character for a beginner to pick up. I think because of many of his abilities having relatively short range, but then some others don't. You have to use the shields effectively, you have to use his debuff effectively and all that. I think that takes a fair bit more practice to get down to a degree where you can really have the same impact as with the other characters. That by no means means that he's bad in any way. The opposite. I think if you're good at him, you can be extremely effective. But I do believe that for a beginner, it's just relatively difficult to get the full potential of this character going, and if you don't get the full potential of this character going, he feels less effective than many others on the roster. Again, this doesn't mean that he's bad at all. This is just C tier, that's slightly below B. This is just about how hard or easy it is to pick him up and do the same work that you can do with someone like Finn, where I would say it's just exponentially easier to do the same thing with Finn as with him. The other two here are not released yet, so I have no idea how they will be, so we're not putting them on the list. But that is it for now. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you enjoyed this tier list, this overview of the characters in Multiversus. If you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing and clicking the bell. If you want to see more info about Multiversus, I've got a bunch of guides coming up. The next one is going to be a LeBron guide. I've been spamming him constantly, and I've got quite a few tricks already that I've not seen mentioned anywhere else. So I hope you stay tuned for that. And other than that, thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you for the next one soon. Geek Sloth, out.